Hello AP Biology students, let's go over the 9th section in Unit 7. And in this section, we're going to talk about something called speciation. Up until this point, we've been talking about how evolution can change a species, but in this section, we're going to talk about what happens and how speciation actually occurs. Before I get into the topic of speciation, we need to understand the biological species concept. For two organisms to be considered the same species, they have to be able to mate and produce fertile offspring. Now, this definition of what a species isn't perfect. What that means is that this definition has flaws. What about asexual organisms that don't need another organism to reproduce? What about species that are fossilized? How do we know when two organisms are not a part of the same species? And what about hybrids, like mules coming from donkeys and horses? So this definition or concept of a species is really tough to pin down, and I don't think it's ever going to be perfectly identified because life is just very interesting and broad. However, when using that definition, the process of one species becoming and splitting off into another species is called speciation. You can see in our diagram here, a single species of organisms with variation will slowly over time become two organisms based on a number of factors. This could be artificial selection, natural selection, sexual selection, but for whatever reason, this group of organisms of the same species will eventually diverge and become two separate species. The two different types of speciation that I'm going to go over next are called allopatric and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation occurs when there is a separation of a group of organisms by some geographical barrier. This stops the gene flow between these two groups of organisms enough where these two populations will speciate or become two distinct species. You can see in our diagram here our original population being split by some geographical barrier, and then over time speciation produces two distinct species. The other type of speciation is called sympatric speciation. This occurs when there isn't a geographical barrier, and for whatever reason there's a mutation that prevents the organisms from reproducing even though they are living in the same environment. As you can see, we have our original population. Within that population, there is some mutation that creates a reproduction barrier, and that reproduction barrier is again going to create two distinct species. A topic that I also like to cover in this section is called micro and macro evolution, even though they are the same thing. I just like to have my students understand these concepts because people will try to use these different terms to try and discredit evolution. Microevolution are the small changes in allele frequencies in a population, which are usually, again, smaller changes over smaller periods of time. Macroevolution is just larger scale microevolution or speciation. This is just evolution over longer periods of time. So microevolution would be like a beetle changing its color over time, and macroevolution would be like speciation of the dinosaurs. Again, I don't like using these vocab terms in class because, again, they are the same thing. Microevolution is just smaller macro and vice versa. However, I want my students to know that people will try to use it and say, well, I'll accept micro versus macro when, again, they are the same thing. I like using this chart to show the differences between micro and macroevolution, where micro, again, is smaller changes and macro is the larger change, but again, these use each other. So again, macro is just larger scale micro, while micro is just smaller scale macro.